documenting photographer, he says this, quote, "Assuming that the shroud were manufactured in the 14th century, it would mean that someone would have had to conceive the concept of photography approximately 650 years before it was invented. I don't think so," end quote. Some of these scourge marks on the shroud appear only under ultraviolet light, which means that the forger would have to paint the marks so that they'd be invisible to the naked eye and then discern that ultraviolet equipment be invented some 650 years later. That's impossible. There's not a trace of paint pigment on the shroud. There are no brush strokes. The images on the shroud are directionless and therefore could not be painted, at least not by a human hand. Kevin Moran, optical engineer, says this, quote, "The shroud image is made from tiny fibers that are 1/10 the size of a human hair. The picture elements are actually randomly distributed like the dots in your newspaper photograph or magazine photograph. To do this, you would need an incredibly accurate atomic laser. This technology does not exist," end quote. And also, if someone was to paint the shroud, they would have to have a 20-foot-long brush because the image isn't even discernible much closer than that. They also found blood on the Shroud of Turin. According to medical physicist Dr. John Heller and blood specialist Dr. Alan Adler, they found not only the markings on the shroud were blood, but blood highly loaded with bilirubin, a bile pigment that would only show up if a dead man had been severely or traumatically beaten. And pathologist Pierre Ballon came to the further conclusion that the blood spots were human blood and of the type AB. In fact, there are 13 tests that confirmed that blood was on the shroud. The image on the shroud is negative, but the blood marks are positive. The blood marks on the shroud have remained red, and why it hasn't darkened by time and oxidation is unexplainable. At the back of the toes on the shroud, there's an original bleeding when the man was alive, and then in the tomb there was a renewed bleeding. So 2 blood flows, and this is impossible for someone to forge. In fact, the experts were shocked by the way the blood evidence was transferred to the shroud. It was done perfectly without one smear, which practically, humanly speaking, is impossible. Dr. Max Frey was a Swiss criminologist. He was one of the leading experts in dust and pollen analysis in the whole world. In fact, he single-handedly developed a technique to determine where criminals had been by testing samples of dust and pollen from their clothing. And he was consulted on many crimes by police forces of many nations. Dr. Frey's objective was very simple. If the shroud was forged in France in the 14th century, then only the French or Italian pollens will be found in the cloth. But his exhaustive analysis found some 58 specific pollens, only 17 were native to Europe. The rest were from Palestine and southern Turkey, the site of Edessa and Constantinople, and this meant that the shroud had been in these places at some time in its history. In fact, 13 of the pollens come exclusively from Palestine and are growing in Israel today. Professor Reza Lovain